Typographics for having me. It's quite an honor to be here. As mentioned, I am a senior designer at Knopf for the last 5 years. And I'm lucky enough to get to design book jackets for both the Knopf and Pantheon imprints of Penguin Random House. I work on many different types of books: novels, nonfiction, short stories, poetry, memoirs, biographies, and typically I'm designing about or over 30 covers a year. And I also tend to do a bunch of freelance, mostly more book covers and also illustration for newspapers and magazines. But before I go into my own work, I wanted to quickly tell you guys a little bit about Knopf, since they have such a great cultural history and have some of the greatest books today. So, it was founded in 1915 by Alfred A. Knopf and his wife Blanche, and they quickly became known for their attention to detail and their literary content, design, typography, and in their high quality of their physical books. Alfred decided to appropriate colophons, which at the time were only displayed in the back of limited edition books. They describe in great length the typefaces typographers and printers used, and they gave Knopf trade books the prestige of a special edition book. Excuse me. This example is from 1931 and is set in Bodoni by W.A. Dwiggins, and we still use the colophon today. They also wanted a distinctive logo, and Blanche, who had taken to Russian sighthounds, suggested they use a drawing of a running borzoi. And the logo was recreated many times by great designers like Paul Rand, Alvin Lustig, and W.A. Dwiggins, to name a few. And now, Knopf has hundreds of borzoids in its collection, and it's really fun to pick and choose which one goes best with the design of the book jacket. And I think this archive of logo is a really great example of the publisher's dedication to the detail, and there are many different ways to approach a book jacket. And there's also many designers who've worked at Knopf that have shaped my view of book cover design before I was even in this industry. I remember shopping in bookstores and gravitating to the work of many of their designers, like Barbara DeWild. This is her work. And she was an associate art director at Knopf for 15 years and is now a creative director at the New York Times. The great Paul Rand, who has done gorgeous work for many book publishers from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And Chip Kidd, the iconic associate art director at Knopf. And the lovely Carol Devine Carson, who recently retired after 32 years with the company. Without her brilliant eye and her wonderful collaboration with our publisher, Sunny Mehta, the rich Knopf history would have been lost. John Gall, who a few years ago was the art director of our paperback imprint, Vintage. I'm happy to say he's back with us now as our new creative director. And Peter Mendelsohn, a former associate art director. Peter is now a creative director of The Atlantic magazine. But their jackets are all timeless and cutting edge, and really the ones that set the bar in the industry, and they had a huge impact on me and my work. And it's funny because my husband is also a really talented book designer, Christopher Brand, and I remember always wishing he'd work at Knopf. And it's just funny to me that it didn't occur to me that I was a possibility until I got this email. And I don't know if you could see, it's so small. From Peter Mendelsohn, and I really couldn't believe it. I was going on an interview with one of my design heroes, and it was pretty surreal. And I somehow managed to get the job, but I'd constantly ask myself, how does my work fit into the rich cultural institution? And this is a thought that's constantly going through my mind as I challenge myself. So book cover design has changed drastically since those days of the covers that I admire so much. Books aren't dead, but there's new challenges now that didn't exist before. Like sometimes people are seeing the cover for the first time in thumbnail form on their screens. And there are book influencers now with massive social media followings. And they actually play an important role in marketing because they share their reviews on their accounts. And if they don't like the cover, they're going to post the interior of the book instead, which is kind of a marketing loss for us. So it's important for our covers to be well-liked and to work well at thumbnail size and in physical form. But the problem is many publishers think the solution is to make the type as loud as possible. Seems to make sense. And when this trend really started to pick up, around the time Instagram became big, these covers were fresh and bold. But the problem is that that was almost a decade ago, and so since then, loud type has become a trend. And regardless of if it's appropriate to the literary content of the book inside, it seems to be on everything. Also, I think it takes away from the design potential of a book in its physical form. Trends do start for a reason, and there's definitely a logic behind the big type. And when it fits the content of the book, it's appropriate. But from a creative standpoint, my question is, what else could we do to make a jacket stand out at thumbnail size, besides just making the type bigger? And like our logos, there are hundreds of solutions to every book cover, not just one. And I think about this a lot in my design. And I always seem to be wanting to bring back the timeless approaches I admire so much. I want to quickly show you a bunch of my jackets, and then I'll go more in depth about a few. And this should have sound. Thank you. So now I want to go a little more into detail with a few. So Voices in the Night was the first book I was assigned at Knopf, and I fell in love with it, so no pressure. Stephen Milhauser is a master of dark humor and magical realism, and the title was very specific to just one story. So I just wanted the art to speak to the book as a whole. A theme in his stories is a struggle between logic and some magical force that takes it off its course. So an illusion came to mind. And as I was exploring different ideas, I went to the Guggenheim and I wound up seeing The Perfect Illusion in the Design of the Building by Frank Lloyd Wright. And I drew it out. And I thought Century School book typeface was appropriate as a nod to old children's books and fables that were told in some of the stories. This was the only cover we showed the editor and author, and it was approved. And also, It was awarded one of the best book covers of the year by the New York Times. I just want to talk a little bit about the presentation process at Knopf, since it's a little different than other publishers. We tend to show 1 to 3 sketches at a time, and I know some other publishers like to show more, at least 6 or more. And this gives us more time to hone in and really make the cover exactly how we want it. We don't have weekly meetings either, and so everything usually is one-on-one with the creative director, editor, and the publisher before it is shown to the sales team. And I think this system is really great and gives the designer more of a voice rather than being in a meeting 10 versus 1. So thanks to Carol Carson for that. Okay, so this one is Very Nice by Marcy Demansky. It's not in stores yet, but I think it comes out next month. And it revolves around a Connecticut family and also takes place in New York City. A college student hooks up with a charming writing professor, and he winds up becoming a house guest in her mother's beautiful Connecticut home over the summer. It's sexy, but it's also underlined with important issues like guns and school shootings and the type of sexual behavior that is acceptable before it crosses the line. And many of the scenes are set around a swimming pool, so everyone really thought a swimming pool scene should go on the cover. And while it's like a really fun summer read, I was worried about the pool scene wouldn't signal to a potential reader the more serious sides of the story. A common thread in the book was how lust was used to melt all the characters' problems away. So to me, the ice is a metaphor for each character, and then lust, along with the pool and the summer sun, are melting the problems away. And first I tried shooting this in my bathroom, but clearly it wasn't working out. I tried really long, it didn't work. So that's when I hired the amazing Justin Matz, and he did a beautiful job rendering this one. And this is Rebecca Schiff, The Bed Moved. These funny stories are about the daily life of a young, sexual, edgy woman. And the author's playfulness with language is sort of erratic and jumpy, and it became another character in the book to me. So I thought it'd be really interesting to somehow express that with just the words of the title. And this is where the sketch started, before some requests from the author and editor. And in this version, I added the short story titles, but they were worried about readability and were a bit nervous to approve it. And I think the only reason I was able to justify this cover was to treat the title as art and to repeat it again with the rest of the copy, so it's there twice. And I remember doing an exercise like this in one of my first graphic design classes at the School of Visual Arts. It's sort of an exercise in how to manipulate the order or the direction of letters and see if it can still easily be read. So it was really fun to bring that back. Stay With Me is a very emotional book. It's a portrait of a marriage in Nigeria that challenges the couple's identity and the battle between traditional and modern values. They struggle with infertility, so the husband's family arranges a second wife for him, one that could produce children, and the book is told through traditional folk tales that they learned growing up. But as the story progresses, the wife creates her own version of the folk tales, one that speaks to her own life. So I wanted to capture the spirit of the author's writing by loosely originating something from a previous generation. And the art is obviously inspired by Matisse, just like the narrator of this book was inspired by the fables before her time. And I really enjoyed the empty space between the figures, so I wanted to make sure the type wasn't too overbearing. I also thought it was important that the type be handwritten and feminine because the story was so intimate. And I don't know if you can see, there was a great review of the book in the New York Times, and it was really, book review, and it was really cool to see a shout out of the cover in it. It's always really cool when your work is being acknowledged somewhere. And just one more. This is Cherry by Nico Walker. And this book is insane. The narrator has a very blunt and unique voice. He's a young man who joins the army, and when he returns from Iraq, he's greeted with drug addiction, PTSD, and his girlfriend. And how does he support this new life? By robbing banks, of course. So the story is actually inspired by the author's life, and he wrote this novel on a typewriter in prison. He's just finishing up his sentence now, so the design process of this cover wasn't exactly normal. And the literary agent was the president of a record label company in Mississippi, so his aesthetic was pretty different than most literary agents. And this is one of the initial sketches that I showed to the editor, and everyone liked it in-house. But we received a comment from the agent, and that was it. That was it. So, yeah, that was a fun one to get. I really liked it. But I won't go into detail about them all, but this was a really long design process. I did maybe like 50 to 100 covers. And I loved the book so much, I didn't want to give up. And I did think a skull would be a good symbol for the book, but at first I thought it was too cliche. It's been done so many times before. And how can I execute a skull without it feeling so cliche? So what I like about the final execution is the fact that the skull is secondary to the stars. And it's sort of like all the things in the books that turn bad are some naive mistake. And I wanted the type to feel raw and trippy. And this lettering, called op letter, to the right, did the trick. And I scanned it in from a 1968 alphabet source book. Letter 3, I think it's called. And then what would this book be without an accompanying video of a guy robbing books about a guy who robbed banks? Everyone thought that this was a PR stunt, but unfortunately, Knopf can't take credit for this.